I made reference in a previous video to a recently published, in 2016, a new book by Donald Lopez at the University of Michigan. It's called The Lotus Sutra, a Biography, and I would certainly recommend it for your consideration if you have an interest in the Lotus Sutra, particularly in terms of either a summary of its content and the plot, and or an analysis of how a focus on it evolved particularly in China and Japan over the course of centuries. But what I wanted to focus on in this video is the fact that Dr. Lopez, he would ask his University of Michigan undergraduate students who were taking his course on Buddhism 101, wherein he had them to actually read the Lotus Sutra. He asked them what they thought of it, and in particular asked them if they had any questions. And he listed some of the questions in his introduction to this book. I'd like to focus on some of those questions, and also I'd like to give maybe some of my own spontaneous reactions to the questions. One student remarks that he or she learned how one text completely changes the image of the Buddha from a truthful, good-hearted being to a deceitful, sly teacher who lies in order to help our ignorance. Well, I would put a focus there and underline about 10 times the words "to help." The purpose of the Buddha's use of skillful means in the Lotus Sutra is clearly to help us, and his motivation stems from his compassion regarding our ignorance that in chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra is characterized in terms of us being in a burning house and being so preoccupied with our desires and attachments that we don't see even the fact that we are in a burning house at times. But inevitably, as the student refers to him, the earlier, quote, truthful version of the Buddha, namely the historical Sakyamuni, said that, inevitably life does involve suffering. And the Buddha within the Lotus Sutra, characterized as Sakyamuni, but obviously written at a time long after the historical Buddha's death, is basically saying the same thing in that sense. He's saying that, we don't really think about the fact that inevitably we will suffer, we will experience loss, we will experience grief. So the Buddha uses skillful means to, bring us along a certain ways toward a more awakened state. But what he's saying in the Lotus Sutra is that that's not the final state. The final state is one where we ourselves are committed to not just our own enlightenment, not just our own transcendence from the baser forms of our dissatisfactions in life, but where we orient ourselves toward, and again, as the student indicated in his statement of what he learned, to help others. That's the bottom line. That this Buddha within the Lotus Sutra, in chapter 2, where the skillful means are discussed, is trying to help others out of his compassion for our suffering. So another student says, Mahayana Buddhism makes me pretty sad. He or she says, I feel like they just made up an easy way for everyone to feel special. Well, in many ways, we are all special. And, the student, of course, is referring to the fact that Mahayana Buddhism, it does provide easy ways to complement the harder ways. And it includes both, frankly. I mean, if you want a harder way, there are harder ways that one can pursue. But there are also easier ways, the most extreme of which is the one that I've touted and indicated as my lineage, namely true Pure Land Buddhism, where, it's a recognition, frankly, of pure grace, in the sense that, there's nothing we can contrive or do to, quote, achieve or attain our own, liberation, if you will. And, from another standpoint, there are teachings, as I've indicated in some other videos, within Mahayana Buddhism that talks about the fact that if you view reality from a non-dual perspective, is there a difference between enlightenment and non-enlightenment? In other words, maybe the only obstacle to being enlightened is not having to tread some difficult path, but I say merely, merely may not mean it's easy, but merely seeing that if we live in the here and now, if that is where our focus and our consciousness resides, that at that moment in time, we are Buddha. And again, that, I guess you could say, that's easy but not simple. Another student says, is the rest of this class about the Mahayana teachings? It's crazy how betrayed I feel after reading just a few chapters, after about 11 lectures. Can't imagine how the arhats must have felt. Well, I can sympathize and appreciate this sentiment, because clearly the Lotus Sutra does have an axe to grind. I mean, they came on the scene having to defend or put forward an argument for the superiority of their particular doctrine and teaching in the context of probably an environment where Theravadan Buddhism, or the earlier forms of Buddhism based on the Pali Canon, where those were dominant, and where the ideal was the arhat, and where the arhat was the supremely honorable kind of being, having attained essentially a state of non-attachment and a state of nirvana. And if you read carefully though within the Lotus Sutra, I would make the point that I don't think that it's so much that the Buddha within the Lotus Sutra puts down the arhat truly, as much as that he says that that's not the end of the road. That's not the final nirvana. That's not the final goal, if you will, to the extent that we want to think about there being a goal. And again, within the Lotus Sutra, obviously, what is articulated there is the bodhisattva path that leads to Buddhahood, and all beings eventually attain Buddhahood. One of the interesting aspects of Dr. Lopez's book is when he describes the teachings of the Chinese master Z, I believe. I don't know if that's how his name is pronounced, but basically he was one of the foremost devotees of the Lotus Sutra, and he wanted to portray the Lotus as being in many ways the supreme teaching, okay? So he had these various levels and talked about them in terms of different phases of time, in terms of the development of the doctrine, the Buddha Dharma, over the course of time. And those of you who have actually read the sutra will recall that there's one point in one of the early chapters where, as the Buddha is, beginning, based on the entreaty of one of his main disciples, he's beginning to actually contemplate teaching the one Buddha vehicle, which is a main teaching of the Lotus. Several of the monks leave, and he calls them haughty, and these are presumably rigid adherents to the earlier form of Buddhism. And from one standpoint, you say, well, that's derogatory toward them, because he doesn't encourage them to stay. He calls them useless twigs and leaves, I think. But it's interesting, what Z says is that there actually is a sutra complementary to the Lotus that fits within the same time frame, more or less, but slightly after the Lotus, which is the Parinirvana Sutra. So the question comes up, well, if the Lotus is supreme and the Lotus was his final teaching, why did the Buddha on his deathbed, or shortly before his Parinirvana, or his death, why did he teach the Parinirvana Sutra? And as Lopez describes it, interestingly, the perspective of Z was that, this was the teaching for those monks that had previously left the assembly, and then they eventually, presumably, came back and were receptive at that point to this more profound teaching of universal salvation that the student is reacting to. So let's see now the student. Another one says, the Lotus Sutras venture into the more fanciful and supernatural, in my mind, seems to delegitimize all the basic Buddhist principles. Now that's a very interesting one. Again, he calls it fanciful and supernatural. Well, I can understand that, but I can particularly understand it because I just got done reciting and uploading the chapter. I believe it's 26 of the Lotus Sutra on the Dharinis. These are like magic spells or mantras that supposedly have power to protect the person who expounds the Lotus Sutra. Well, the way we have to relate to these fanciful things, maybe a couple of kinds of ways. One, to view them metaphorically, some of them, as parables, in order to teach in a perhaps in the context of a story. And human beings have related to stories throughout our history. Stories can be very powerful. And, because a story may not be literally / historically / scientifically true, doesn't mean there's not truth in the sort of deeper meaning of the story in terms of how it relates to our own experience of it within our mind, within our heart, within our spiritual sensitivities, if you will. So that's one angle. Another angle is just simply that, as I've said over and over and over again, and as many people have said, is that the truth cannot be expressed in words or concepts, okay? That's certainly basic, again, to many mystical approaches within various religious traditions, and looking within Buddhism. I mean, it's taken into its extreme form, perhaps, within Zen Buddhism, which basically poo-poos all, or at least most scriptures and written forms of trying to describe truth, saying that, we can't, all we can see is the finger pointing at the moon in terms of use of concepts and language. So if that's the case, though, and if we have an impulse to communicate to help people, well, what do we do? What do we use? We may use more fanciful language. And then finally, a third that comes to my mind just now as I'm sort of spontaneously reacting to these questions is that, making reference back to the student who talked about the easy way, people, some people do have a tendency to want to believe in magic, in the supernatural, in the talisman, and in the efficacy, the power of the mantra. Is that bad? Well, it depends. I mean, it could be bad if it means contradicting basic scientific findings that are important to accept in order for us to, live in a better world, a more humanitarian world. But when it comes to spirituality, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe the negative effects are outweighed by the sense of hope, the sense of confidence, the sense of being willing to and able to tolerate, to muddle through difficult life circumstances. So anyhow, those are some thoughts I have regarding the supernatural, fanciful aspects of the Lotus Sutra. Here we have a student asking, why did people not turn on the Buddha after he admitted lying to them? Well, the ones who stayed in the assembly recognized that he was trying to help them, and of course they also kind of they appreciated hearing his prediction that they were going to become Buddhas. I mean, that was kind of cool, because up until that time they did not think that was within the purview of what they would have in their futures. So they were kind of hearing something that they may have wanted to hear. And again, it wasn't lying per se. I think that eventually we all will become Buddhas, okay? Or you can say, in one sense, we all are already Buddhas. So was the Buddha really lying in that sense? These are tactful methods. These are provisional teachings. But in the Lotus Sutra, he's really taking the veil off. He's saying, really, this is the truth. I'm giving it to you straight now. That a lot of the kinds of teachings that I have put forward, and that you can extrapolate and say that other religious persons, teachers have put forward, these are all provisional means to help us. These are the raft to help get us to the other shore. And so rather than being mad that the raft isn't the other shore, there's a sense of gratitude that at least now we have a vehicle to get there. And then one who says, how can people accept the words of one monk who decided to write a text to completely change Buddhism? Well, first of all, it didn't completely change Buddhism. There are some very smart Theravadan Buddhists who point out the fact that, the essence of the Bodhisattva in many ways is embedded within the Theravadan teachings. But also, this wasn't just one monk, as my understanding is. There were a lot of folks within India during that time period of 100 BC to 600 AD who were contemplating many deep things. I would point to Nagarjuna as one prime example, who many Mahayana Buddhist traditions take as their first patriarch, who established the Madhyamika school and really tried through logic to articulate the truth of non-duality. Or Vasubandhu, who established the Yogacaran school of mind only. So again, that's just two primary examples. But there must have been many monks, many authors who helped contribute. And frankly, I think that while the core of the Lotus Sutra may have been established at a particular time, it was added to. And of course, there's a lot of Mahayana sutras. So there were a lot of people utilizing this kind of approach to scripture, to writing these wonderful altruistic treatises that we are very fortunate, in my opinion, to have available to us in this day and age to reflect upon and to help us understand the essence of wisdom and compassion and to pursue the Bodhisattva path.